Good morning and good afternoon in Europe and good evening in Israel. I'm Bill Kennedy, your host and GIC's Vice Chair of Programming. On behalf of the Global Interdependence Center's Board of Directors, welcome to this executive briefing. Today, we will examine the COVID-19 pandemic's economic impact on Europe and Israel. Our objective is to explore the interdependencies of trade, labor, banking, and economic policy. As a reminder, this event is being recorded and the replay will be available later today through the GIC website. Joining us for today's discussion are Michala Marcussen and Daniel Schiffman. Michala Marcussen is the Group Chief Economist for Société Générale based in Paris. As Head of Economic and Sector Research within the Risk Division of the bank, she leads a team of over 30 economists and sector engineers, and Michala is a member of Société Générale's Group Management Committee. She has been with the bank since 1994 and began her career in 1986 and has worked in Copenhagen, Brussels, London, and Paris. Dr. Daniel Schiffman is a professor at Ariel University in Israel. The GIC is proud to have Ariel University as a partner organization, and we thank Ariel University for their continued sponsorship. Dr. Schiffman is in the Department of Economics and Business Administration and specializes in economic history and the history of economic thought. He has published on a diverse set of topics, including U.S. railroads during the Great Depression era, Jewish monetary thought, and the influence of foreign economic advisors on Israel's economic policy. Michala and Daniel, welcome to the executive briefing. So Dr. Schiffman, you are our first presenter. We will turn the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's truly a pleasure to be here. I would like to begin with an historical perspective. Please advance to the next slide. How does the current COVID-19 recession compare with the Great Depression that began in 1929 and the Great Recession that began in 2008? Well, the current recession began with a contraction that was much more severe than what we saw even in the Great Depression. However, the economy reached the trough after only 3 months and began a rapid V-shaped recovery. And that contrasts with the Great Recession, in which the trough was reached after 10 months, and the Great Depression, which was absolutely horrific. The trough was only reached after 36 months. And the question is, why? What makes the current recession unique? Let's continue on, please. In terms of macroeconomics, what makes the current recession unique? Well, as we just saw, the initial contraction was sharper, and the reason why the initial contraction was sharper is because, unlike the previous recessions, which were demand-induced, the current recession is due to mutually reinforcing supply and demand shocks. On the supply side, workers were unable to get to their jobs. Restaurants, hotels, and entertainment venues had to shut down. And on the demand side, the usual culprits. Businesses postpone investment due to uncertainty. Households postpone consumption because of fear of unemployment, as we all know. And this recession is unique because the consumption decline is actually concentrated in services. and not durables as in the Great Recession. Another factor that differentiates the current recession, actually it doesn't differentiate, this factor is actually in common with the Great Recession. We have aggressive fiscal and monetary expansion. Policymakers realize that they have to do whatever it takes in order to mitigate the negative effects of the recession, as opposed to the Great Depression, where policymakers were passive, unfortunately. Now, this contraction is unique because it was caused by a non-financial event. And there was, of course, a great concern that the health crisis would cause an economic crisis, which would in turn cause a financial crisis. But so far, policymakers have successfully averted financial crisis. Therefore, there's no financial mess to clean up. We don't have banks with weak balance sheets, non-performing loans, a crisis in the shadow banking sector. We don't have any of that. And therefore, we observe rapid V-shaped recoveries, not the painfully slow recoveries associated with financial crises. And I recall that in the 2012 campaign, Bill Clinton said it wasn't fair to expect President Obama to bring us to recovery so fast. 4 years is just too quick. And I had to agree with that observation, because when you have financial crises, recoveries are painfully slow. We don't have that now. And that's why we see the rapid V-shaped recoveries. The moment the health crisis is over, we can recover quickly. And in the United States, the Fed has a new corporate bond facility, which it did not have in 2008. And research by Michael Bordo and his collaborators has shown that this corporate bond facility was effective and has limited defaults, bankruptcies, and credit collapse, exactly as intended. Continuing on, let's talk about labor and education. This recession is unique because it has hit women hardest. And that's because women tend to be concentrated in services, and because of school closings, they face increased childcare responsibilities. In the 2008 recession, manufacturing and services were especially affected. Those are predominantly male occupations. Now it's predominantly female occupations. And if we look at women who are still employed, right there, many women have had to drop out of the labor force or work part-time. If you look at those women who are still employed and are telecommuting, and you compare them to men, among telecommuters with children, women have experienced a larger productivity decline. So even women who are working have been hit harder than men who are working. And how does this affect children? Well, school closings, distance learning. This has had an adverse effect on educational attainment. We're already seeing some research that begins to measure that, and increased educational inequality, because poorer children are hit harder. And that's something we never saw in previous recessions. Now, why are poor children adversely affected, and more so than well-off children? Because their parents are less involved. They often lack internet access. They often don't have the reading opportunities and materials that other children have. And this may be a trivial point. A child who has his own room has an easier time studying online as opposed to a child who doesn't have his own room. So tighter living spaces are not helpful when it comes to distance learning. Continuing on, let me now address what has been going on in the global trading system. And now let's discuss the pre-COVID reality. And then we'll get to what's likely to happen now. We had almost 3 decades of liberalization and a rapid rise in the ratio of world exports to GDP between 1980 and 2008. And many observers said that that increase in global trade integration is wonderful, but it's unsustainable. And sure enough, after 2008, we entered a new phase, a phase that has been dubbed slowbalization. And that name was given by the Economist magazine. Slowbalization, that is a stagnation in global trade integration. Surely we're still much more integrated than we were in 1980, but less so than we were in 2008. Continuing on, global value chain trade, which at one point was over 50% of global trade, has stagnated. Now it's about 48% of global trade. Global value chain trade is defined as trade that crosses more than one border. And the World Bank devoted its World Development Report 2020 to the topic of global value chains. I encourage all of you to take a look at it. It's fascinating. There are also videos that the World Bank produced in which they describe this phenomenon of global value chains, why it's important, and what are the trends, what are the pros, and what are the cons. Continuing on, in the era of globalization, trade liberalization has stalled. The Doha round is still going on and hasn't reached a successful conclusion. It began in 2001. So even by the standards of global trade negotiations, that's rather slow. And as I think many of you know, protectionism has surged. We all know that Donald Trump decided to be more aggressive towards China. We know that he imposed tariffs. Here you see the United States trade policy from 2018 to 2019. If you drink scotch, there's some good news. President Biden did not renew the tariffs that Trump imposed on Scotch whiskey. But overall, we see greater protectionism, a retreat from globalization by our elected officials. And the question is why? Let's continue to the next slide, in which we're going to see why there's declining support for globalization in the United States, and in fact, a backlash against globalization that leads to the election of politicians like President Trump and has actually reshaped the Republican Party, at least in terms of its views towards global trade. From 1979 to 2007, as the United States became more and more globally integrated, as you can see in blue in panel A on the left, as the United States became more and more globally integrated, income inequality rose. Now, we cannot say based on this graph alone that trade has caused inequality, but the correlation is telling. And at the same time, as described as shown in panel B, the United States tax system became less progressive. It favors the wealthy more, and it's less helpful to the less educated, to those earning lower wages. And therefore, lower wage workers, less educated workers feel more and more alienated. They feel that the system is not working for them. And I encourage you to take a look at a book by Luigi Zingales called Capitalism for the People, which states that those of us who care about capitalism, care about the market system, we value the benefits. We have to understand that if people don't feel included, if increasing numbers of people feel left out, they're going to elect politicians who are going to cause very serious damage to the capitalist system. So it's better if we take charge and make an effort to deal with the problems and make these people feel included. And that will make it possible to sustain and to enjoy the gains from capitalism rather than what we're seeing now, where capitalism, I wouldn't say it's threatened, but capitalism faces some very serious political challenges. Continuing on, well, how will the COVID-19 recession affect international trade? Penny Goldberg of Princeton predicts that populism, nationalism, and protectionism will continue to strengthen, which will further destabilize the global trade regime. And also with some points made by Marcus Brunermeyer of Princeton, for essential products, nations are going to shift to a very different supply system than we've had up to now. The emphasis will be on dynamic efficiency rather than static efficiency. And the chart explains what that means. The post-COVID reality is going to be a reality where nations are less specialized, manufacturers will be less specialized, and we're going to see more suppliers from more countries. Because during COVID, we had situations where countries couldn't test for the virus because the manufacturers of chemical reagents, there were very few manufacturers, and those manufacturers couldn't supply enough, and countries were left without vital supplies. And in order to avoid that, countries are not going to rely on such a limited number of suppliers. They're going to want more suppliers from more nations in order to be better prepared for pandemics, natural disasters. And instead of trying to minimize excess capacity and operate according to just-in-time, which means minimum inventories, countries are going to prepare by having greater excess capacity and larger inventories. So they won't just look at what's efficient now, they're going to look at what's efficient in terms of emergency preparation, in terms of being ready for tail events. Continuing on. I'm based in Israel, so I'd like to give you a picture of what's going on here in Israel. Israel is the world's leader in vaccination. This is a remarkable achievement. But as I'm going to show you, not all is rosy. The United States is making some nice progress, and I'd like to point out that in Philadelphia County, where the GIC is based, the share of the population fully vaccinated against COVID is very close to the national average. Continuing on, in the last 2 months, COVID has declined drastically in Israel, and that's wonderful news. Continuing on, let's describe the initial conditions in Israel, favorable and unfavorable, and luck. Well, we have a small, densely populated country, so it's easy to vaccinate. The weather is warm, the population is young, and by international standards, we have a low rate of cardiovascular disease. We also have an efficient public HMO system with well-developed information systems and vast emergency management experience. Now, unfortunately, we've experienced wars and terrorism, but our physicians have tremendous experience with dealing with emergencies. Now, on a personal note, the first day that people in my age group were able to get vaccinated, I made an appointment and I had my first vaccination. Immediately, And that was truly wonderful. And I hope that that's the way it's going to be in the United States. I know that that's not always the case, but hopefully those of you who need to be vaccinated, I hope it's a very easy experience, very, very quick and efficient. We have an excellent scientific research infrastructure and strong economic fundamentals coming into the crisis. Continuing on. The unfavorable conditions are that since April of 2019, we've had 4 elections. We still do not have a government. We have a caretaker government. We don't have a regular budget, policy uncertainty. This is no way to run a country. And Israelis have a culture of not taking rules and regulations so seriously. And tourists often see it very, very quickly. Our hospitals for years have been understaffed and overcrowded. And schools are overcrowded, and educators were not prepared for online learning when the pandemic hit. Now, we do have good luck. Infections are concentrated among ages 20 to 55. Continuing on, let me talk about some policy mistakes that were made here, and perhaps other countries can learn from our experience. The testing, tracing, and isolation infrastructure was set up way too slowly and was ineffective at first. Things are much better now. Our airport was not closed when it should have been, and quarantine of incoming travelers was not enforced. And unfortunately, we imported the UK variant, which is very, very infectious. This could have been avoided, and critics charged that the government was very sensitive to diplomatic considerations, did not want to offend the Trump administration and our new peace partner, the United Arab Emirates. Among minorities, the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, age 60 plus mortality rates were very, very high. And this unfortunately derives from the historic alienation of these groups from state institutions, from a failure of the government to communicate adequately. Now it's a little better, but communication in their language, this is something that certainly applies to the United States. And also failure to consistently enforce restrictions in those sectors. We had 3 nationwide lockdowns that were progressively less effective. That's something that you see worldwide. The traffic light system, in which local restrictions are in line with local infection rates, that was rarely utilized, and critics charged that that was politically motivated. Netanyahu did not want to stigmatize ultra-Orthodox and risk alienating the ultra-Orthodox parties. But on a professional level, we probably should have had the traffic light system. Continuing on, and this will be my last slide. Restrictions were lifted too quickly in May 2020, and then we had a very, very severe second wave. K-12 education has been managed chaotically. We don't have proper social distancing in the schools. Transfers to households were not targeted, but you can argue that that was justified by the need for speed, because there's always a trade-off between giving aid as quickly as possible and means testing. Because if we means test a benefit, then we need to set up an elaborate bureaucratic apparatus. So Prime Minister Netanyahu's chief economic advisor went against the views of the finance ministry, and he advised speed, prioritizing speed over means testing. Now, we have a furlough system in the realm of unemployment insurance. We have a furlough system that was extended through June 2021, which is very rigid and disincentivizes returning to work. So employers are reporting that they can't find workers. And there's a lively debate about this, whether or not we should adopt a scheme that's modeled on the German Kurzarbeit or short work program. Now, the Bank of Israel thinks that it's very questionable whether that's advisable, a German type system. And in any case, it would be hard to implement it in Israel due to administrative limitations. Thank you very much.
Dr. Schiffman, thank you very much for your insights. We are getting questions here that regarding historical perspective. So please stick around. We'd like to have you come back on for the Q&A. And so we're going to transition now and bring up slides for Michala. And Michala Marcussen is going to give us a perspective on Europe. So Colleen, if we could bring up the next set of slides, please.
So just as we wait for the slides to come up, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today on Europe. And as you'll see when I dive into my presentation, our basic view is that Europe could see quite a fast restart once the economies reopen and social distancing measures are lifted. However, we see a number of challenges that mean beyond this initial restart, we think that we're in for a fairly slow recovery. So just kicking off here on my first slide, I just wanted to give you a bit of a perspective on what the crisis has looked like here in Europe. And I thought I'd zoom in on France, where I'm based, just to share with you what the various, what we call them confinements, lockdowns, what they've looked like. So just looking here at April 2020, so those are the red bars, and November 2020, where we had a second lockdown, you can see that compared to the level of GDP in 2019, in the fourth quarter of 2019, those two episodes of social distancing, of very tough social distancing, showed very, very different impacts on the economy. Now, there are a couple of different reasons why. First of all, during the first lockdown, big chunks of industry and construction were shut down. And you can see this on the chart very clearly. While in the second lockdown, these sectors were allowed to continue to operate and essentially managed to keep activity levels reasonably good. Looking at the market services, again, more market services were able to operate. But what I found was quite striking was that even for the hardest hit services, so just zooming in, you can see the bars in clear are the bars that are a little bit faded are subgroups on the market services. And just zooming in on accommodation and catering, what you can appreciate is that there was a lot of adaptation that took place between the two lockdowns, such that once we got to the November lockdown, a number of restaurants were operating services such as click and collect. In fact, in France, we've seen a record number of business creations during this crisis, a lot of those linked to delivery services. So we really get a sense that the economy has also figured out a way to adapt to this still very challenging situation. But clearly, it was a much better situation, although still very difficult in November compared to April. Moving on, you can see on this next slide also how the ECB has adjusted its forecast over time. Just looking here, well, I'll just focus on the top of the table. But if we look in June 2020, the ECB shared three scenarios with us: a mild, a central, and a severe. And what I've done in the final column of each of these is just add up relative to a base 100 in 2019, the accumulated loss. So if we just take the most severe scenario, you can see that that would have given an accumulated loss on the ECB's forecast in June 2020 of 27.7 points of GDP, just relative to a flat scenario of 100. You can see that even the latest forecast from the ECB from March 2021 sees something far less dire, even in the severe scenario. So this is actually quite positive, because when it comes to the scarring effects of the crisis, of course, the depth of the crisis will matter in terms of the dynamics. So it's, of course, still a highly uncertain scenario. But I think it's encouraging to see that some of our worst fears have not materialized. Moving on. You can also appreciate that something that has been incredibly helpful around the world, and I should say that I've basically included packages here that have been voted through, and I distinguish between on-budget and off-budget measures. I've drawn to a large extent on the IMF analysis here for these numbers, but also adjusted them in some cases to reflect our own observations. But what you can see here is you can see the on-balance sheet measures in terms of fiscal stimulus. So these are all the measures that engage an immediate expenditure for the government, or an immediate revenue loss in the case of tax relief. And then you can see the off-balance sheet measures, which are, of course, things like all of the government guarantees. Now, I do urge a lot of caution. It's a little bit tempting to look across the Atlantic and conclude that the US has done massive fiscal stimulus and Europe hasn't done that much. Just a few points worth note. First of all, there are very different labor market structures between our different economies on both sides of the Atlantic, which means that the unemployment systems in Europe work much more through the automatic fiscal adjustment, whereas in the US, the unemployment system is based on people being able to get back into jobs more quickly, and just tends to be less generous in normal times. This is one factor. A second factor also relates to how the public sector works, where my understanding is that in the US, there's been more layoffs at state and local levels. And we, of course, hope that these people will soon be back in their jobs. And I understand this is already happening now. Whereas in Europe, we didn't have the same adjustments in the public sector. So this is another important difference. So just to be cautious on the comparisons. Nonetheless, when we look at some of the most recent measures, especially with the new infrastructure plan from President Biden, our sense is that the US is most likely being more aggressive than Europe once we factor in this plan. So as we look at the economic outlook, I would say at the current juncture, first of all, we've seen that the economies in Europe, I showed you the case of France, but we've seen similar situations elsewhere, have shown good adaptability. Moreover, we have a significant stimulus on the cards. I zoomed in here on fiscal stimulus, but the same can be said in terms of the very accommodative monetary policy. In addition to that, we have very large pent-up savings. So on this basis, once social distancing measures can be fully lifted and lockdowns can be rolled back, what we can expect to see is a very fast restart of the economy. And this is also something that we observed already last summer. Question is, looking beyond this initial period, what can we expect to see longer term? And here I'd like to turn to some of the challenges that I see for the euro area. The first challenge I'd like to highlight to you on the next slide is the financial fragmentation. Indeed, when we go back to the previous crisis, and unfortunately this does tend to be the case, Europe tends to get its quantum leaps in crisis. It was very good news. We got a banking union. But what we have not been able to do in Europe is advance quickly enough on that banking union, advance quickly enough on the capital markets union. And when you look at these indicators from the ECB, you can see that the ECB does two measures of financial fragmentation. One, which is based on price. So this is questions of correlations and movements between, for example, equity prices, bond yields, etc. And one which is done on quantity, which seeks to measure cross-border portfolio holdings, cross-border banking, so basically the financial integration of the euro area. And what you can see on the chart is that as the euro was created in 1999, there was a very big acceleration in terms of the quantity-based financial integration. Then it started to lose a bit of momentum and actually went backwards after the great financial crisis and the euro area debt crisis, and has since then recovered a little, but has not returned to its pre-crisis levels. Now, this metric is absolutely critical in terms of the financial integration. And moving ahead, it's very important that Europe advance on this, and not least in the context of Brexit. Keep in mind that London was essentially the most important financial center also for the euro area. So it's clear that there's a challenge here for Europe. And when I do make the contrast across the Atlantic, this financial fragmentation is a factor that continues to hold back the growth potential of the euro area. The next challenge that we need to consider, which relates to this, relates again to the financial conditions, is really banking sector profitability. So one of my colleagues did this chart a number of years ago, and he called it the Banking Misery Index, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think it captures very nicely the challenges that we see in terms of the respective banking systems, and again, captures some of this financial fragmentation. So what does the chart do? It basically adds up the 3-month rate, the 5-year inflation swaps, and a forward-looking measure of a GDP consensus on a 12-month rolling basis. And of course, the most recent data have been quite volatile, just because the GDP data have been very volatile. But you can appreciate structurally the differences between the US situation and the European situation. And you can appreciate that this does have consequences as well for the real economy. So moving on to what I've called my challenge number 2, the second big challenge for Europe is to come up with a more credible path for public finances. Now, on a very positive note, this crisis brought the Next Generation EU Fund, and we had the good news earlier this week that the German Constitutional Court, which had asked the German president to temporarily hold off signing, has actually now lifted that, and basically Germany is now in a position to ratify the Next Generation EU Fund. This is a 750 billion euro facility, which is very much part of Europe's recovery plan. What I wanted to show you a little bit on this chart is that very often when we discuss public finance stability, we focus on the snowball effect. So we're looking at the differential between the interest rate and the nominal GDP growth. This is very well known and will be well known to many of you. I just wanted to highlight another dimension which is equally important, especially in this new debate where we're using the fiscal policy tool quite aggressively on both sides of the Atlantic for recovery. So it's a very simple calculation I do. I basically just look at what happens when you run a fiscal expansion of 1% of GDP, and then I put different multiplier assumptions on what that fiscal policy expansion does to GDP growth. So I don't have anything else in the model, no interest rates, no other growth, nothing else. So it's very, very simple. But what it tells us is that we have to be sure that the public investments, which is a big part of the policy stimulus, carries a 0.8% multiplier at least. And that means that these public investments have to be quite efficient. Now, I did the example here for public debt levels at 120% of GDP. You can, if you're interested, you can work on this. It will vary, but the higher the debt, the easier the demands are in terms of the stimulus. But I would just be on the multiplier, but I would just warn a little bit on that. But you can still see that we need to make sure that the public investments are well oriented. And in fact, this has been one of the challenges that we've historically seen in Japan, is that even when the Japanese government have conducted large fiscal spending programs, the multiplier effects have in many instances been weak. So we haven't had that impulse. So I would highlight to you, yes, the snowball debate is key, but to my mind, the more important factor here is whether the public fiscal policies that are being put in place today will have the positive multiplier effects on the real economy and spill over to drive private investment as well. And here I'm a little bit more concerned. I would also highlight to you the risk in Europe of a premature tightening of fiscal policy. Now, on a positive note, the so-called escape clause of the Stability Pact is active and will be active through 2022. Beyond that, there's a new debate emerging on European fiscal rules. Now, it's a complicated debate, and in the interest of time, I won't dive into detail on this, but I would just highlight to you that it's a point to be aware of. And of course, with a very busy political agenda ahead in Europe, we have elections in Germany this autumn, in France in the spring of 2022, and then we should probably have an election in Italy sometime in the course of 23, perhaps before. But what you need to be mindful of is that this debate on the fiscal policy rules is going to be very important. And of course, there's also the debate on the ECB's upcoming monetary policy strategy review. Just looking at some of the challenges in Europe, I would also highlight to you on the next slide professional mobility as being a very important challenge. Indeed, what we tend to see, coming back to those multiplier effects, is that countries that have flexible labor markets and very strong educational programs, and here I'm not just talking about schooling, but also about lifelong learning, tend to do better in coming out of crisis and tend to enjoy stronger economic growth over the long term. On the slide, you can see that I put the OECD. There are two things here on this slide. The top slide is the proportion of low-skilled adults. The lower slide is the proportion of underqualified workers. And you can see in many of the European economies, they tend to suffer on both fronts. These are studies done by the OECD. They're a little bit dated now, but these are things that tend not to change that quickly. Although I would note that many of the economies are trying to put in place policies to address these issues. My concern is that as this economy, as we come out from this crisis, in a crisis which has been shaped by significant sector heterogeneity, and one of the challenges will be to move people from one sector to the other, especially with the digital transition, the climate transition. I think that this will be a headwind. This low professional mobility will be a headwind. I also just wanted to highlight to you another point, moving on. You can see here the question of social mobility. Indeed, when we look here in Europe, most of the European economies have quite good income distribution after taxes and social transfers. Now, we can always discuss where to set the cursor and how much we should improve. But I would emphasize to you that there is a separate challenge from income equality, which is social mobility. And what is social mobility about? Well, this is a study that's done by the OECD, and essentially it captures the number of generations it takes for those born into low-income families to approach the mean income in their various societies. And you can see, just zooming in on France and Germany, that here the number is 6 generations. That's actually just a tad higher than the United States, and very much higher than the Nordic economies, where the number is 2 to 3 generations. And this social mobility tends to link in as well to educational outcomes. And it's something that's very important to address, especially to improve that social mobility in terms also of growth potential, but also in terms of political stability. So I just wanted to share that with you. And as a final thought, I already mentioned a little bit about sharing about the new rules in the pipeline and about the ECB's monetary policy review. But just moving over to the fifth challenge, I set this as a distinct challenge in itself. And I would say that in the short term, the one that we're probably focusing the most on is the ECB's monetary policy strategy review. So the ECB is basically looking at different elements, and we expect the results of the strategy review probably sometime in September. And basically, we know the ECB, like the Fed, has struggled to hit its inflation targets. There's a debate on the employment dimension, on societal trends, on how fiscal policy works in a monetary union, and on financial stability. And I just wanted to zoom in on this question of macroprudential policy, because it seems to me that the debate is shaping up in quite a different way on both sides of the Atlantic. In Europe, there is increasingly a discussion as to whether macroprudential policy should be used to create more room for monetary policy. And if you just flip over to the next slide, I offer a few thoughts on this here. So if we think about what macroprudential policies are, well, basically, these are setting things like loan-to-value caps on housing loans, counter-cyclical capital cushions in the banking system, large exposures. And one of the big debates that we see emerging at the ECB, and you will have seen this from many ECB speakers, is whether we should have a set of macroprudential rules also for the non-bank system, which would focus typically on margins and on collateral. There are a number of challenges that arise from macroprudential policy. First of all, as they tend to focus very much on individual market segments, the individual instruments have very narrow challenge. Moreover, they tend to center on volume rather than flows. There's a concern as well that they may be prone to more asymmetry in the multiplier effects. If you look at the latest, if you read some of the macroprudential bulletins from the ECB, there's been a lot of discussion as to why banks have not lowered their capital levels more in response to the current crisis. Indeed, we can talk about a paradox of capital in the way that while it may make sense at the macroeconomic level to see capital levels lowered and making full use of the room offered by the policy, from an individual institutional point of view, it may not make sense. So it's a little bit like the well-known paradox of thrift that we know from household savings. So, and then of course, the final issue on macroprudential is on the policy side. So as we look at Europe today, I would say that we see a number of these structural changes, be it the financial fragmentation that we can see, be it in terms of making sure that the policy that is set is sufficiently efficient in terms of its multiplier effects, be it in terms of managing professional mobility, social mobility, or be it in terms of setting new rules for governance for monetary and fiscal policy. There is a lot of opportunity here for Europe to improve and deliver. I believe that this process is likely to prove a fairly slow one. And this is why after a fast restart, our expectation is to see a fairly slow recovery. And I'll stop my comments there.
Terrific. So, Michala, thank you. Daniel, thank you both for terrific presentations. And now we're going to turn to our audience Q&A. And I'd just like to remind our attendees that you can enter a question at the bottom of your screen. Just find the Q&A button and you can type your question in and we'll get it into the queue. We've had a couple of questions that have come in, and maybe while we're waiting for a few more, Dr. Schiffman correctly highlighted fair and free trade for Scotch whiskey. Michala, that's good news. What about Burgundy? What about French wines? What can we expect there?
So I think, you know, if we well, you can definitely expect continued free trade on that front, as at least as far as France is concerned. I think what's very interesting in this post-crisis debate is we're clearly seeing climate as becoming the new big discussion, and Europe is very much committed to free trade. But I think we're going to see a lot of challenges coming out. As you know, Europe would like to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and designing something like that within respect of the WTOs is likely to prove quite challenging. But I think if we look at how businesses operate, I think the bigger question to my mind is how global supply chains will be organized in the future. And my sense is that we're likely to see a trade-off between, I would say, cost minimization and resilience. Just as an example, think about what's been going on in the semiconductor sector recently. No doubt in the future, those companies that were caught short on semiconductors will want to maintain slightly higher inventories. Just think about what happened on the health crisis. A number of governments were caught short in terms of masks and hand gel. And I would expect moving ahead, once again, higher inventories will be held. And I think we can take a number of examples like that. So while I don't believe that we're going to see a complete reversal of globalization, I do expect that this post-crisis environment will bring a rethink of supply chains, and that combined with climate considerations could have some very specific, very significant implications on individual industries. So this is something that I would expect to see, but I think that Europe will remain committed to free trade, and I think this will be the case for the US as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we have a question here, probably for both of you. I'll start with you, Dr. Schiffman. Has the fiscal monetary response to the pandemic, is there any precedent in history?
Any precedent in history? Well, 2008, the policymakers understood that it's necessary to do whatever it takes. We had Ben Bernanke as Fed chairman, and Ben Bernanke is one of the leading scholars in the world on the Great Depression. And once he understood what was going on, he understood that very aggressive measures would have to be taken in order to prevent a complete financial meltdown, and that the Fed has to operate as a lender of last resort, which is where it failed during the Great Depression. This is a famous insight of Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, and that we could not repeat the mistakes of the Great Depression. And also during the Great Depression, I think there's a misconception that, once Keynes wrote his book, and once Keynes had his ideas about the importance of fiscal expansion during depressions, that everybody adopted the policies that he recommended. In fact, Keynes met with both Hoover and Roosevelt, and he didn't get very far with either of them. Both of them were very, very cautious with regard to deficits. And that's why Paul Krugman wrote in 2009, he wrote a New York Times op-ed entitled Franklin Delano Obama. Franklin Delano Obama, meaning that Obama should not be fearful of deficits the way Roosevelt was. Obama should do whatever it takes on the fiscal front. Now, of course, things didn't exactly work out that way because of the issues between Obama and Congress, but I definitely think that the lessons of the Great Depression have been learned. They were learned in 2008, and certainly right now we see very, very aggressive actions by both the fiscal and monetary authorities. We also have a commitment not to withdraw stimulus until it's too early. Especially the Fed has been saying we're not going to raise interest rates or curtail our bond purchasing until we see actual inflation, not forecast inflation, actual inflation. So there's a new monetary policy framework guiding the Fed.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Michala, same question to you. When you look back through economic history, any precedents for what we're seeing in terms of fiscal and monetary response?
Well, I would agree very much with what we just heard. Maybe just to add a few thoughts to that, I do think that there is a bit of a shift happening on the policy front in the current juncture. I'm struck by the fact that we hear central banks increasingly talking about inequality. And this to me is something quite new, and we've heard it very much from the Fed, but also it's a preoccupation for the ECB. And as you know, the ECB is also very focused on the climate dimension of monetary policy. So it seems to me that these new topics are something that have entered monetary policy at the current juncture. Some of that was happening already prior to this crisis, so it wasn't triggered by the crisis per se, but I do think that shift is very interesting. And as Dr. Schiffman highlighted, the shift in Fed policy towards more of a makeup strategy. And I also think that we're seeing a shift in fiscal policy because, yes, the idea of very strong cyclical support is certainly something that we recognize. But what seems to be a little bit new is the recognized role that public investment has to play a greater role, and especially linking into the climate transition. So again, I think we are seeing some very significant shifts in the policy framework. And to my mind, one of the big challenges for the markets, especially as the economies gain momentum right now, will be able to make the distinction between what is temporary, linked to a fast restart, pickup in inflation, and what is more permanent. And I think especially with the shifting monetary policy, it may become harder to distinguish permanent from temporary. And I think this is going to be potentially a bit of a challenge for the financial markets over the coming quarters.
And to that point, Michala, do you think that leads to more economic volatility or not as we look forward?
Well, I think there's certainly a risk of seeing more economic volatility from two sources. So I mentioned the idea that we may be in a world where we're holding slightly higher inventories. And, you know, I remember from my youth as a younger economist looking at inventory cycles, which is something that we have not been debating quite as much in recent years. So I think the return of an inventory cycle, depending on the extent to what happens there, could become a source of economic volatility. And then in addition to that, we could see more volatility on financial markets if markets are struggling to distinguish between those various permanent and temporary factors. Of course, much of this will also boil down to just how well understood the public policies will be, both in terms of the fiscal policy and in managing the rollback of the temporary support measures, and in terms of the monetary policy in clearly communicating what these new monetary policy strategies mean.
Great, thank you. Dr. Schiffman, in your presentation, you had a slide that discussed the pandemic changes to expect, talking about less specialization and more manufacturers in terms of the quantity of production. Are there specific sectors or industries that you think that will have the most impact?
I think it's hard to say beyond personal protective equipment, medical supplies, anything deemed essential. That's where we're likely to see it. Is it going to affect bicycles or cellular phones? I would imagine that it would be primarily in essential goods.
Excellent. So this will be our last question, and I'm going to ask both of you to speak to it, but Dr. Schiffman, maybe we'll start with you. Just the topic is immigration, and what's the impact of immigration we have seen, especially in Europe, on trend growth and potential GDP activity going forward, as well as from an inflation versus disinflationary perspective. Dr. Schiffman, you want to try that first?
To be honest with you, I haven't thought about that issue. Despite the anti-globalization forces and the slowdown in global trade integration, immigration has not slowed down. What's the macroeconomic impact of that? I haven't really thought about that.
Fair enough. Thank you. Michala, how about you?
Well, let me take the example of the UK, where what we saw in the pre-Brexit era was actually that immigration from the rest of the EU was a tremendously positive boost to the UK economy, adding several decimal points to the trend potential growth. And I think that with Brexit, the risk is that the UK will lose some of this growth potential. So when I look at immigration, I think we see examples from around the world of how it can be a very positive for growth. For that to happen, the governments need to have good policies in place so that immigrants are well integrated into the labor markets. But I just think that UK example gives us some very positive hope. And I think that immigration is definitely a trend that's here to stay. And I think that well managed, it can really be a very positive driver for everyone.
Excellent. Thank you. Audience, thank you very much for some excellent questions and for your attention. Michala and Daniel, thank you for a fascinating conversation and for spending time with the GIC community. And the GIC wants to again thank Ariel University for their sponsorship in memory of Greylock. We thank both of our speakers, and we hope you will both join us again soon on the executive briefing. So audience, before we close, a reminder that the replay of all of our executive briefings are available on the GIC website. We are excited to announce that next week, on Thursday, April 29th, the GIC will host a very special awards program when we will present the Frederick Heldring Award for Global Leadership to Dr. Charles Goodhart of the London School of Economics and author of Goodhart's Law. In addition to receiving the Distinguished Heldring Award, Dr. Goodhart and his co-author, Manoj Pradhan, will discuss their recently published book, The Great Demographic Reversal: Aging Societies, Waning Inequality, and an Inflation Revival. So I think a very good tie-in to the conversation that we just had. So again, that is next Thursday, the 29th of April, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You may register for that event, contribute to the tribute booklet, and find information on how to purchase Dr. Goodhart's book on the GIC website. That's at www.interdependence.org. As we conclude, we encourage you to take 60 seconds to respond to our audience survey. Your feedback is very important to us. Let us know how we can improve our programming. Thank you for your attention. Have a good day and a good evening.